Hey guys, this is James Adams. I'm out of the office currently, so I made this pre-recorded presentation where we will be going over HTL or Sightly, and I'm going to talk about a couple code samples, code snippets, how do you implement a couple things, and my presentation is based off this blog, which is the Adobe.com Experience Delivers, and I will be showing you samples from the Stanford project just because it's the project I'm the most familiar with. The first thing I want to do is go over JSPs just so we can gain a better appreciation of why Sightly makes it so much better. So this is a JSP file from Stanford, and as you can see, we have a couple import statements. We have this section. This section is called a scriptlet, and within it we can do standard Java code. We have this other section. This is a tag. Is basically a definition that we add, and then within JSPs we can set variables. We can let me scroll down. We have some logic within the JSPs. But even just at a glance, as you look at this file, it's pretty messy. And for starters, as you can see right here, we have the clinic associated pages tag. And this tag then needs to be defined in a TLD file. And from there, we still need to have a definition in Java for it. So for example, it's called, as you can see, this tag definition, we have the tag, the name, and then we have a tag class which links it to this Java file, and here we have the public class. So to implement JSPs from the get-go, you already have to mess with it on three different places. And then from there, let's go back to the JSP file. When you implement the logic, we have some scriptlet going on right here. Then we have an if statement, and if that happens, then we have this tag, this JSP definition. I think it's called JSPL or something. JSPL tags that are built into JSPs, and as you can even just glancing, you can see how messy it is. You have an if statement for setting this meta tag to show it on the page or not. And then we basically have the same functionality, but this time is done within the confines of the scriptlet right here. And we display these other meta tags. It's just messy. You have so much going on so many different ways, and it doesn't help for readability. So that's why Sightly, I guess, was made. It's supposed to make things easier. We have a templating language that we can use, and it's got some logic and some helper methods that we can then use to make more readable code. So this is how a JSP works. So now let's look at the parts of a Sightly component. And on a Sightly component, we have a few different things. We have the dialogues right there and right here. Just the stuff the user will interact with when they author it on the page. We have the client lives. That's where the CSS and the JavaScript lives. And then we have the HTML code. This HTML file is where we would write the Sightly. And then if our Sightly requires, we can then make calls to data providers. At least in the Stanford project, we sort of have a standard where all the data providers go in this folder, and then the naming convention, it's component name data provider. So it just makes it easier to be able to find them and work with them when we need to. So now that you know a little bit or have some idea of all the parts of a Sightly HTL component, Let me show you guys the file. So this is the structure of a Sightly component that we have in Stanford. We have our container div and a bunch of other definitions. It looks very much uh, like plain HTML, and intermingled within the HTML we have these specific Sightly things. We have the data provider definition, we have data Sightly test, data Sightly list, and so on and so forth. So now let's go over how do we link HTL file, or should I say the HTML HTL file with the data provider. The syntax is data slide use, and then you give it a name, data provider. And in this case, yeah, really creative name, data provider, but you can actually name it whatever you want. All you need to know is you have to be consistent within the file, what you're gonna call it from that point on. And right here is the path to it, to the Java file. So in my case, it was process circles data provider. And going back to the file, if you look at this line, why is it lagging so much? There we go. We have my div, it's a container. The container then uses data slide use, which tells Sightly I'm gonna call it data provider from this point on within this, and also within the scope of my div, and then equals, and right here is the path to my Java data provider. So then by doing that, as I work with my file, and I can then make calls data provider right here, it's defined. I can call data provider dot and use getter methods within it to do the various things that I might have to do for this particular component. So now let's go on to a few things that we can do within Sightly. And the first thing is current page. Current page gives us access to properties within the page itself. And the way we do that syntax is $current page, and then we can call name, title, or whatever else lives within our page. So let's take a look at this this HTML file. And as you can see, we have current page.path. So in our case, I would retrieve the slash content slash en slash whatever the path to the page is, and then we're appending HTML. So we can make calls to all sorts of page properties like that. In JSPs we have there is current page as well, but we really should try to get away from JSPs as much as we can. One reason why using current page can be useful is you don't always have to use a data provider for all your Sightly components or HTL components. So if all you're doing is kind of making a component that just displays information, you can use current page and not have to use a data provider and read the page properties. The next thing is component properties. So when you drop a component on a page and the dialog comes up, and then the authors can then enter a title or pictures or whatever, we can call those using this $ open bracket properties, and then we can call whatever is defined in the dialog field. For example, taking a look at this ease of access component that we use in Stanford, as you can see, we have data slide test properties that title text. In this title text, we can actually find it if we go to the dialog.xml file for the same component. We can find title text right here. So what we're doing is we're basically saying within the Sightly right here, we're saying, hey, go get me from the dialog that the user author, the user field that they can enter information, go get me the title text, and I'm just going to check if it exists. And if it exists, I'm going to put it on this div and use it however the component was built. So the next thing I would like to talk about is WCM mode. That allows you to detect if you're in author mode or normal visitor user to the site. The syntax for that is just $ bracket WCM mode edit or WCM mode design. And here's an example of why you will want to use WCM mode in Sightly. So take a look at this file really quick, and you can see right here, WCM mode edit equals false. One thing is, when you use the data slide test, it means you're gonna do a check, and then I have my condition right here, WCM mode edit, and if WCM mode edit equals false, meaning this is for people coming into the site as a visitor, then this entire block right here, the computer's lagging a bit, the entire block right here is what will be displayed for those visitor users. And then what I have is this next block right here, which is WCM mode edit, meaning I am an author to the site. Then I want all the parsers to just show up, all this content right here, and then I want to make it all available at once for authors to be able to drop their components or edit text or whatever they need to do. So next, I would like to go over HTL operators. Operators use the data slide test tag, and operators are very much like, in normal code. You have the or, the equals, not equals. There's also the greater than, less than, all the standard software operators. So now let's look at an example. Let me find a good one. So right here, for example, I have a div and I'm calling data slide test. And within that, I'm doing a call to my data provider. And the data provider has a property of actually a method that returns circle or tab. And if it's a circle, I'm doing a check if it circles. And if that becomes true, then this entire div will be visible. If that condition is false, since I declared the slide test right here on this div, this entire thing will not appear. So you can see how powerful it is to use conditional operators, and you can hide and show divs accordingly. Oh, when I say hide and show, I don't mean they'll be hidden in CSS. I mean they will not show up on the markup. The next thing I want to show you guys is how to include or embed other files inside your HTL Sightly file. So you do that by using data slide include, and then you would just point to the file you want to have. For example, on this Sightly component, there's a call to Sightly data Sightly include, and we're pointing to this in-page nav JSP. And this is what's inside that JSP. So since this is server side, when it gets rendered client side, all this markup will be above all this stuff that belongs to the component. So that way you can share code, you can share code that is common. Maybe say there's a header that you want to have on every single component box, if you will. You can just make a call to data Sightly include, and that will show up with every component. The next thing I would like to show you guys is data slide unwrap. That's basically used if you, It's better to show you with an example, quite frankly. So my example is right here. So say, for example, you can see that we have a div. Let me move that up. So we have a div surrounding this entire block, and we have a call to a data provider. We're using a test. And so I talked about this earlier. We have a test. If the test is true or false, it will display what's inside this div. But the data slide unwrap will make it so when this renders, basically it'll render like this, like as if the div doesn't exist. In the case of on this piece of the code, the div is really just a scope container, if you will, meaning that this test will only affect the stuff between the opening and the closing div, and the unwrap will make it so when it renders client side, this div will not be visible to the user. It's mainly used for logic, so you can use unwrap for logic where you need to scope it out with a div, but you don't want that to show up on the final markup when clients hit the page. So next, we're going to look at doing lists in Sightly. Lists can be objects or arrays or anything that has information, and you need to recursively display it on the markup. So what I have right here is the tag data slide list, and then that tells Sightly that you're going to use a list. Then you follow it by some sort of name or identifier for each element on the list that then you can use recursively. And then right here is where you make your call to the actual element or list. And then within the scope of these two UL tags, you can call this identifier, and then you can display the information as needed. So looking at this sample code, I have a div, process tabs container, data slide list. I'm defining the identifier for each element on the list is going to be list.tabs, and then I'm getting that from my data provider. And then inside the scope of this div, I'm calling tabs and I'm pulling the anchor link ID. Now, to set up the list to work properly on the data provider side, it's not quite as straightforward as it seems. So here I am in the data provider file. Notice that I have an array list called elements list, and this list has a get elements list accessor method. So when you look right here in the HTML file is elements list. In Sightly, the way you use data providers is you name it get elements list, but then when you use it in Sightly, you do it like that with the first letter lowercase and without the get. Now, going back here, notice how it says anchor link ID. So in the data provider, basically that list is populated with process circle objects. So we have let me move that up. So we have the constructor for it. We have some information. One of the information in the constructor is the anchor link ID. And then within this object, we have, actually I renamed it earlier, we have a get anchor link ID method. This get anchor link ID then gets called right here anchor link, and just like it happened with the get element, when you call, so you define it as get anchor link ID in your Java, and when you call it from your HTL Sightly, you do it by just doing anchor link ID without the get and the first letter being an underscore. This is really useful to iterate and to create objects that maybe carry a lot of information and you can display it. It's actually quite cool and useful how Sightly does it. Also, when you use lists in Sightly, for example, um, you have other operators you can use. So I have a data slide list. I'm naming each element that I'm iterating child. I'm calling it from a data provider. So I'm calling the child.title. Okay, that's just what we went over. But also you have other things you can do, like you can do child list dot odd. So every odd element, it'll display something. Then child list dot first. That will make it so only for the first element on the list, it'll display that. You can do child list dot last, which only when it comes to the last element of the list will display. This is a Sightly thing, so you'll notice that right here I defined each element that is being pulled from the data provider list as just child. Um, okay, as just child, but then to use it to do the odd or even, you have to do whatever you name it here, followed by list, and then dot, and then you can add if you want to do the odd, evens, first, and last. This is really useful if, say, you have a bunch of components, you have a list of 4, and then you need the very first element on the list to have an active class, or if you want the last element on the list to have, say, a close class, or if every other element you need to alternate some sort of color or something. Let me show you an example. So right here, I define a list of as elements, just like I did before. And then what I'm doing in here is, if the element list, so I have my identifier, I follow my identifier followed by the word lists, uppercase L, that first. So if this is the first element that I'm in the list, I'm gonna add this, and if it's not, I'm gonna add this other class. So this is really useful for, like I said, alternating colors, tabs being opened based on their position, things like that. So the next thing I want to show you guys is how do you declare a parses inside a Sightly HTML, HTL file. So the way you do it in this sample is, I have a div and I'm calling data slide resource. If you Google it, there's documentation for what kind of resources you can call. It's not just limited to parses, but for this example, I'm using parses. And then you follow it by $, open bracket, par, right here. This is a name you give it, kind of a Sightly variable. And then you follow it by the resource type right here. So let me show you a quick example of that. And it's right here. So what I have here is a div, data slide resource. I'm giving it path equals par. This is the name that identifies this parses. So notice I have parses 1, parses 2, parses 3, parses 4, and they're all of the resource type parses. Using data slide resource, you can use it for any type. And like I said, in my example, I'm using parses. So I have PC part 1. Here's one cool thing you can do with that. So notice we're inside this edit mode container, and then doing a search for the same parses identifier. I'm using it inside a circle content. This parses right here, the par1, is the same parses as this one, and is the same parses as this one, and is the same parses as this one. So what I'm trying to say is, in edit mode, in author mode, when they drop a component or edit some text, that parses will travel, or is the same one in all these other calls to that same parses. So for example, like I think I talked about it before, On edit mode, I can have all the parsers show up side by side and open, and then when you go on uh, user client side mode, it will only show as necessary as the users click through it. Let me fire up my AEM instance for a second to show you guys better. So guys, to illustrate the point a little better about parses declarations in Sightly, take this component. So when I click on each one of these circles, is all displaying different sets of information, right? And then when we go to author mode, notice how all the parses for each one of those circles, they're all open and displayed at once. What's happening here is that these parses in the markup are not the same as the ones being used on the circles. But like I showed you before, this parses and this parses have the same name. So by having multiple declarations of parses with the same name, you kind of link them together and you can reuse it that way. Another really cool feature about Sightly is the ability to be able to pass parameters from Sightly or HTL to the data provider. Now, the reason you would want to do that, at least the one reason I found, was I had two similar components. They were buttons, and they had a lot of similar functionality. So, depending on what they both of those components called the same data provider, and I would just pass different parameters, and based on the parameters passed, it would tell it how to behave. I mean, there were enough similarities that didn't warrant writing new code, but by passing a parameter, I can just write code to just address those differences. And the way I did that is data slide use my component. That's just the data provider. And then I'm calling the data provider my component. And by using add param1 and param2, these are the parameters you're passing in. Param1 and param2 are the names of the variables, if you will, and 1 and 2 are the values you're passing in. And then on the, sorry, that should be on the Java side, on the data provider side. The way you would pull those values is by doing, I did something like string param1 get param1 string class. The important part being that this param1 matches this guy up here. Let me show you this sample. I'm gonna have to scroll. So I have my data provider. I'm calling the CTA buttons data provider. And then let me break it. Let me do this. So now it's in view. So I'm calling the data provider. I have an add sign, and then I'm passing a parameter called CTA button type, and I'm calling it clinic. So then when we look at the data provider, we have CTA button type get CTA button type string class. Now notice that this name right here matches matches this guy right there. And now this variable in the data provider called CTA button type now contains that value, and in my code I was able to address the differences that might be between the types of CTA buttons. For this particular component, it's either clinic or doctor, but of course your situation might be different. One last thing that I'm gonna cover today is HTL Sightly and escaping. So for some fields that have rich text editors, Sightly will detect the value that the author entered into that rich text editor, and then it will say this looks like a possible cross-site scripting vulnerability. So I'm not going to render that text as written. And when that happens, know that what you need to do is you need to do either add context HTML or add context unsafe. Now, when you use these context HTML and context unsafe, you need to be careful. You need to watch out that the author, I should say, enters valid information. And the way you know you have an error like this is you would go to your CRXDE and then you need to look for warnings for anti-SAMI XSS. I don't have a good example right now for that. We actually just fixed that error that was happening and I didn't grab a screenshot in time. So should it happen that at some point in the future you find that one of your components is not working quite correctly, the case I've seen most often is when you have an anchor tag and you're populating the href property, and you know your button is rendering but isn't the link is not correct. You want to go to CRXDE, you want to look at your console, and you want to just do a search for anti-SAMI. You want to do a search for something like anti-SAMI or XSS. And if you find any warnings like that, it'll direct you straight to the place you need to go to fix that. And then you fix it by just add context unsafe or add context HTML. Just be careful when you use these tags. And that's all I have for you guys. I hope you guys have a good day. And yeah, I'll be playing Zelda Breath of the Wild. So I'll see you guys Monday.